Well, good morning, everyone. So I was asked to talk a little bit about, engaging stakeholders, water negotiations in the West, and, a lot of great information yesterday, but all the information that we could even desire on the aquifer is not going to make a whole lot of difference unless it's being, shared and understood and used by stakeholders and the decision makers. So what my talk will be on is ideas on how to engage those stakeholders. How do we get them to be informed and to be motivated by it? I was perhaps whining a little bit to a few people. They're just going to feel like Groundhog Day because an awful lot of what I cover really got brought up yesterday. But on the positive side, that means we're all sort of on the same track. A lot of the same ideas that people have on how to engage folks is being utilized at other places. I'm going to touch briefly on negotiation since that was in the title, but from a state position, talk about stakeholder engagement, management development, things that I've had that experience doing in my role at the State Water Office, where, as Jim pointed out, the KGS does not advocate policies, but we certainly did at the Kansas Water Office. And then briefly on some of the challenges that lie ahead. Well, in case you have a short memory from yesterday, the High Plains Aquifer in Kansas, it's shown there in the blue, and the Ogallala is really the area where it's deeper, semi-arid, limited rainfall in that area. And although people like Bill Alley and others discuss the advantage of using surface water and have that groundwater be buffer, that's really not an option out there. Groundwater is a source for all uses for over 92%. And irrigation by far dominates that, but in most of the region, there just isn't much surface water, very limited. So the groundwater management districts, a number of different, with Oklahoma being a remarkable exception, most of the High Plains states have some type of local input. And we have 5 groundwater management districts, all developed roughly in during the 1970s. And that was to give local input on groundwater management and development for economic development, but also conservation. Each GMD board answers to an advisory board that is elected locally. Usually there's a representative from each county and definitely dominated by irrigators. They have some taxing authority, certainly not a huge amount, but they're not as independent as the NRDs in Nebraska or the water conservation districts down in Texas. They do have a management plan, and the decisions that they make must go back through the chief engineer at the state level. And in Kansas, water is managed by the chief engineer, who is the director of the Division of Water Resources, but that lies within the Department of Agriculture. So kind of an understanding of how the predominant use of water in our state is agriculture. So I wanted to talk, just because that was in the title that Cassie so thoughtfully gave me. And I thought, negotiation. Okay, you come to a negotiation, everybody comes to a table, and you think about what outcomes do we want. And from the state level, it's to make sure that we have water for the future. At the Kansas Water Office, we had very few regulatory responsibilities, but we definitely had statutory responsibilities, and one is to assure water for the future. But even working with so you come to that, what is the outcome that you want, and what are the authorities that you have to leverage in that negotiation? So I just wanted to step back for a second on what's the state water law on groundwater. And in Kansas, it is prior appropriation. Since 1945, all groundwater, surface water is under one system. And in Kansas, we refer to it as first in time, first in right. I heard New Mexico say first in line, first in right, but same idea. That once you get that water right, it is not based on the type of use, but on the time that you perfected it. And once that water right is perfected, it is a property right, and it is good in perpetuity. So we have water rights out in western Kansas that have been handed down for generations, and it's severable from the land. So, in fact, it's quite common for a farmer perhaps to sell his or her water right to a municipality. The seniority of that water right travels with that right. So it is a legal right. If a more senior water right user is not getting the full appropriation that their water permit indicates they should have, they can file an impairment claim with the chief engineer. And if after an investigation, if they're determining that it is due to junior rights that came in after them, and that well-on-well interference, then there is an administration. So the chief engineer would either turn off those junior rights or could adjust when or how much they pump so that that senior right gets their full appropriation. However, if it turns out it is due to regional groundwater declines, then no action is taken. It is considered a futile call, meaning it would be turning off a lot of juniors, the seniors not getting their right, and the amount of time for that water level to recover would be futile. No one's getting the economic benefit of that water. So regional groundwater declines are allowed in our groundwater system out in the High Plains Aquifer. And in fact, we have it codified in the Groundwater Management District plans. The Southwest GMD, which is the largest one in our state, has a planned depletion model of allowing 40% depletion over 25 years. Now, I'll just touch real briefly on Colorado because there's many better experts here, but for their Ogallala, it is operated by a modified priority system, is my understanding, and that it is in a designated groundwater basin. So by definition, it's been defined as a groundwater that does not contribute significantly to surface water. So already a senior right cannot declare impairment because of that groundwater pumping. And a good portion of the Ogallala in Colorado is in the North Plains designated basin, and they have a type of management plan that also allows for depletion of 40% over 100 years. And I've talked to some of the managers with their water conservation districts out there, and they say a lot of that water right is really handled as sort of treating them with all kind of an equal status, even though each one of them does have a priority date. Then Texas, which everybody likes to look at, and these are the three states with the greatest declines. That's why I picked these out, actually, in the Ogallala. Texas, the rule of capture, and Steve Waltauer yesterday really explained well the water conservation districts out there. One thing that I think Texas has done very well is the state required those water conservation districts to come up with the desired future conditions. But the landowner has the right to the water under their property. And the reason I just mentioned all of these, and it's especially true, I'm especially aware of it in Kansas, is, in short, as a regulator, there are very few options to force groundwater reductions. Once a water right permit is perfected, it's a property right, or in Texas, it's just by land ownership. That's a legal property right, and the law favors the current water users over future generations. So, it really is limited, and the top-down approach, even if there are some authorities, it's greatly resisted, and the law doesn't really, at least in Kansas, it has not gone well with top-down approaches. We've had a former governor back in, I think it was 2000, Governor Graves, that in his State of the State, had a, let's get sustainability out in the Ogallala by the year 2020. Well, the reaction from irrigators out in western Kansas, you would have thought he asked for their firstborn son. It did not go well. And he quickly dropped that. The next two governors that came in, sustainability or anything to do with the Ogallala was not a priority issue for them. It just didn't get addressed. So top-down change, even if there are authorities there, or if it's moving too quickly, it really just gives those with the current water rights a rallying point to fight it. So for us, we have not found top-down as the approach to take. So I want to talk about how to engage stakeholders and develop solutions, at least how we've been doing it in our state. Data, Kansas, we really are blessed with excellent data on the aquifer. This is the annual monitoring network that Jim showed yesterday of roughly 1,400 wells. So we're seeing in the winter months close to how that aquifer is recovering. But there's roughly 26,000 wells over the High Plains Aquifer. On every single non-domestic well, well, most every single non-domestic well, we have information on it, and that information is online. You can look up what their water right permit is, or if it's vested, if it's before 1945, how much they have in that water right. You can look up the well construction. You can look up what they've been pumping over the years. All of that stuff is online, and it is accessible to the public, along with the models and the reports. KGS gathers a lot of that data, but it's also data that KGS pulls in from other agencies that have the responsibilities to get it. I think this is incredibly important, not only for people that are trying to evaluate it, but also that sense of transparency. What we know, you know, and I think that's hugely important. Along with just having the information on the aquifer, however, is communicating it. And when you get out to talking with stakeholders, it's a rare stakeholder that really understands transmissivity or hydraulic conductivity or even saturated thickness. So when we're talking to folks, this is a map that KGS put out initially, maybe 15 years ago. It's been a while, but that's how do we communicate those aquifer conditions quickly and in a common term. And this is an estimated usable lifetime map. It's putting it in the term of time, that based on a number of simplifications, like there's a well on every quarter section, pumping at 200 GPM for 90 days, and knowing what the hydraulic conductivity is in there and the saturated thickness you'd need to support that level of use, how much longer will that aquifer last? So on here, and this takes it for the last 2 decades, the groundwater change trends over from 96 to 2016, everywhere that's shown in brown is saying there already isn't enough saturated thickness for that level of use. And if it's red or orange, it's 50 years or less. But then also you can see the yellows, areas that may be more than 100 years. So definitely it's a simplification, but that's an excellent discussion point depending on the group that you're talking to. So I think having the data behind all and the details when you're working with the stakeholders is critically important, but having quick, simple messages. And I think what Jim and his co-researchers have done recently, and he showed you just one example in the Northwest, that 23% reduction, that's doable, for them. And I think that's going to be a real motivating factor for the stakeholders out there. Now, we all know there is not one number, right? So somebody in one a little further west versus somebody a little further east, it's going to vary. But just knowing that number and having it simplified for that discussion has been really important. Another thing I will say on data is no matter, how much data we have, data alone does not bring the solutions, but you absolutely have to have the data for having an informed decision on what's coming along. So, another area that I think data is very important on, and that is the economics of water use. Certainly, that's the number one concern is if I reduce my irrigation, I'm going to reduce my crop yields, which means you're telling me to take a cut and pay, which is a pretty tough sell, right? This is a graph of the irrigated versus dryland corn yields in southwest Kansas. Some 633,000 acres that it was looked at. It was done by Josh Rowe, who's with the Kansas Department of Ag last spring. And what he was noticing was that trend line there at the top, that over time, that the advantage of irrigation over dry land's been increasing. And just in the last 10 years, having irrigated corn versus dryland corn out there, they were yielding 149 bushels per acre more. And right down here, that's what it translates to on additional revenue. Irrigated, of course, there was the high corn prices and there was the drop. but it's, certainly an advantage. There's the value of irrigation for those guys. But I think a message that we're trying to also send is look at where that trend line's going. It's going up. You're getting more crop per drop, as time continues, which means you're gaining revenue over time with that water. And we're translating that or trying to encourage people into thinking, conserving some water now, you'll make more revenue with it in the future. So using simple graphics is useful for getting that out, just using less water now, have more in the future. And where that crossover point, depends on the location. And we also want economic impact studies. We want case studies, and we want projections. Because for people making these decisions, particularly the ones that are living with those decisions to cut, which is what will it mean? Will it mean ruin? Yesterday, there was some discussion on that surface water, being impaired by groundwater, driving some of the decisions. This is an example of where it happened. There was a surface water right that goes to a place called Cheyenne Bottoms, which is a wetland of international importance, one of the Ramsar sites, pretty significant place for Kansas. They had a very senior surface water right, and they were not getting what their surface water right entitled them to due to groundwater pumping. So in 1992, a new program came in that cut down a number of irrigators. So Bill Golden went back and took a look at what kind of economic hit did those that had the reductions. And the groundwater rights that were junior to that wetlands area were reduced anywhere from 25 to up to 70%. And what he saw, and retroactively looking at the data, is those that were reduced took a cut in that 92 and for a couple of years, but then they adjusted and they came back to what some of the local counties that weren't reduced came back to, which is encouraging. There was at least some initial, maybe they were over-conservative, but they figured out a way to do good management with it and were able to recover. Every groundwater model that we have developed out in western Kansas, we have also joined in and had an ag economist do an economic impact model. So if they conserve this much, what is potential economic impact? So that type of information is one that irrigators want quite a bit, the crystal ball. Number 2, identify stakeholders, and of course that tricky one, and build trust. This map is a map that we put into the Kansas Water Plan, and it was identifying high priority areas out in the High Plains Aquifer. And we based it on the rate of decline, the density of water use, and how much saturated thickness there was left. And then we showed it to all the groundwater management districts because we said probably can't prioritize everything at once. Here's, a first shot unless you have another recommendation. And Southwest, they went with that default. But all the other GMDs came in with their recommendations. Now, West Central Kansas, our Lake Wobegon place, they said we're all above average, we're all a priority. But actually they have kind of approached it out there. So that's why it's all priority. In the Northwest, the GMD staff out there went and defined where the 6 priority areas, and then the staff went out, and often the KGS and the Division of Water Resources went with them and explained the aquifer conditions to all the landowners out there and the water users and said, here's the conditions, here's the projections, what do you want to do? Stakeholders also go beyond just those that are using the water, of course. Farm Bureau, seed dealers, pesticide dealers, or depending on what you're talking about, it may be the entire state. So identifying the stakeholders really depends on the program that you're working with. Just mentioned building trust. I think people were saying yesterday, you may never completely get trust, but the main thing is you go out frequently, You try to be open and honest. Again, what we know, you know. Try to give them that information. And again, just it's relationship building right in the end. You know, if they feel that you're trustworthy, they may not agree with you, but at least you're being honest. That goes a long ways. Number 3 is leadership. And that's Governor Brownback. For us, we have found it's very useful to bring the gravitas of the governor's office saying the declines in the High Plains Aquifer is an enormous challenge. It's a big natural resource issue for our state. So he's the first governor actually to pick this up again after the one that had kind of offered a solution that was rejected. And Governor Brownback actually really understands the water situation. He used to be the Kansas Secretary of Ag, so he's pretty aware of it. And he assures them, his administration will not impose a top-down solution. But he said, folks, this is a serious issue, and you know, how do we want to treat it? So he's bringing the attention to it from that top leadership, but we really worked to develop the local leadership. That's where the solutions that are going to be culturally and politically acceptable are being defined. And the 2 groups that our experience has been that have been the leaders, one that are the family farmers. This is a fellow up in the Northwest that helped with one of the programs I'll talk about later, get it developed. Here's in the West Central, one of the irrigators out there, trying to encourage, you know, some kind of conservation solution to have water for the future. The family farmers that have kids or grandkids that are going to go into that business, saying, you know, I was given this opportunity. I want to make sure that they have this opportunity as well. Not everybody's in that. A lot of them have had kids that have left, and they have no interest in, you know, they want to get their value now. But there's a lot of family farmers, and that collective consensus goes a long way. Another group that I think is real important are the industry leaders, and they're just starting to really speak up. We didn't hear too much yesterday about the animal agriculture out there, and if you look at the revenue that's generated by animal ag, it far exceeds the revenue that's generated by irrigated crops. So we have huge feedlots from West Central Kansas all the way down to the Panhandle of Texas. You may not know it, but it is the cattle feeding capital of the world. Huge. And this particular feedlot, about 250,000 cattle are run through it a year. It's enormous. And they are in an area that's water short, and they know they want to have irrigated crops around them because they need that silage. And it's too expensive to be importing high moisture crops for silage. Not only cattle industry, but dairies are growing out in western Kansas, and in fact over the entire High Plains Aquifer. And they definitely need high moisture crops. So industry is thinking as well long term. We have a 50-year business plan. We want to make sure that we're in business and we have the water to support it. So they're reaching out and even offering perhaps farmers that are irrigating to use less, but they would perhaps pay them a premium on that. I'm going to go a little faster. Meetings and beyond meetings. One, I think everybody knows is, you know the outcomes when you're holding a meeting. What are you trying to get out of it? We often will tie in with other people's meetings. We don't necessarily have to have it an individual one that we go to. And that last one, I think, is pretty important. Recognize once you're starting to get out there, locals may be meeting without any of the state agencies. And of course, there's always that question like, oh, what are they planning? That's a good thing, because that means they're taking the ownership of it, and they'll call you when they need you type thing. A lot of field demonstrations on irrigation systems, more outreach beyond meetings. This is a couple pictures from taking state legislators out to look at policy issues back in August. In fact, we took them to western Kansas to look at a lot of the water conservation issues. 4, aquifer conservation programs, boundaries and rules. That senior right that wasn't getting its water that I mentioned, implemented a new program referred to as an intensive groundwater use control area, done in 1992, where a groundwater management district asked the chief engineer, can we find some solution other than shutting off all these junior wells? And it gives them additional tools for flexibilities. So it's a share the shortage type approach. I got to tell you, though, it was difficult, a lot of public hearings. The farmers out there actually came back okay, but it was so so painful, like chemotherapy. There has not been another IGUCA out there since since this one was implemented in 1992. So we move forward, and I mentioned the priority areas up here. A new program developed that Jim mentioned yesterday, the local enhanced management area, where the main difference, again, is giving more tools beyond just strict prior appropriation, but the groundwater management district controls it. They submit a plan to the chief engineer to approve, but his option is he can either approve it, deny it, or send it back with recommendations. He cannot say, well, 20% is a good cut, but I really think you better go 30. He cannot do that. If he sends it back because he doesn't think it's sufficient, they can walk away. No harm, no foul. But once approved, then everybody that's within that district obeys by the laws. It has a form and function of law, force and function. But it is controlled by the groundwater management district. Then water conservation areas have also come in a couple years ago. They too have those flexibilities, but the difference is they do not have to work for the GMD. They go directly to the chief engineer, and the control is at that very local level. And they all have to voluntarily join it. But again, once ordered, it has a form and function of law, and they have increased flexibilities on how to use their water right. And then nested institutional support. Ann Bleed mentioned Eleanor Ostrom, and I'd say Kansas really has fallen into a lot of what she's recommended. I have to admit it's not by design, it's more by trial and error, but we ended up finding the same direction. And the state agencies administer these programs, they enforce them, and they monitor them. And federal agencies have been important, definitely USDA with cost share programs and crop insurance, USGS, of course, for aquifer conditions. So just real briefly mention some of the challenges ahead. The desire to change depends on the individual situation, the well conditions, the aquifer conditions. Is the aquifer shallow there? Does the well, falling apart? How old are they? And then technology. Kansas is very enthused, as is Texas and Colorado, about that potential in technology, but it may help or it may not. The trends in irrigation systems has been that farmers are putting in more efficient systems when their well capacities are declining. This is a graph that KGS put together when they were modeling West Central, just a couple of counties out in West Central. The reduction in flood irrigation with center pivots with the drop nozzles picking up, and where that crossover point varies. At the water office, we've spent millions of dollars at the state level, not to mention at NRCS level, cost sharing of more efficient irrigation systems. I bet most of your states have. And we said, well, is it really working? Are we getting water conservation? And the USGS study and a K-State study says, no, we're not. They're doing more crop, it's more production, but significantly no conservation overall. In fact, the USGS says we're growing more high water use crops on more acres, so with more production, which is good for the farmer, not good for what the intent of that cost share was. So, one of the cautions that we're looking at on these highly efficient irrigation systems is, will it actually save wet water, or is that farmer going to make that huge investment when their well capacity drops? Because as we moved from flood to center pivot with drop nozzles, and now, I don't know if you've seen this one before, but this is where you have these long hoses that are attached there, and they just drag them along. It's called a mobile drip irrigation, highly efficient, really an advantage. But as they go from flood to those more efficient systems, they're able to do it on lower and lower capacity wells. So where you might have needed a 1,000 gallon per minute well to 600 to 300, these mobile drip irrigations work on 200, and they're testing it to see if maybe it can drop down to 150 gallons per minute. In the past, when those well capacities would decline, farmers eventually had to just walk away. They went dry land. But now it allows them to stay in that irrigation. So the question is, will this new technology be used to actually conserve and extend the life of that aquifer, or are they going to just use it to be profitable now? And time will tell. So just a summary. The areas that we find important are the aquifer and the economic data, so that we can show a vision of how they conserve water and still be profitable. Identifying the stakeholders, leadership, get the high-level leadership for the focus, local leadership for solutions at work, and then defining the programs, the boundaries, have clear rules, and allow those programs to alter, as we've allowed ours to alter according to what the local culture accepted, and they felt that trust and that control needed to be. And then the nested institutional support. So the state is doing the enforcement, not the groundwater management district. At least that works better for us. And that's the end. And that, by the way, is a picture from one of those, that wetland that I mentioned that we were protecting with turning off that water.